Good afternoon, Ara.
Morning, Nikos. It's morning here.
Yes, I wanted to discuss architecture and intelligence since I published this article that you know about on how architecture can either improve or reduce intelligence. And there is a beautiful half an hour discussion between these two people who are really intelligent, who understood what the article is about. And I send you the audio of the discussion, and we should make that
Oh,
available somewhere. If you don't have it, I'll send it to you again. But if you have it, please post it.
okay, sure. I have this one, this article,
Well, I don't know what it is. It's called
How Architecture Builds Intelligence, Lessons
exactly.
from
That's the
AI.
article
Yeah.
that's published, and there's the URL. But also, there's also this fantastic audio with this guy talking to this woman that gets very deeply into the ideas in the article, and that is good to put on YouTube.
Okay, I'll check it out. Fractal scaling, nested symmetries,
Yeah,
large
yeah,
scale harmony.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely a recipe for good architecture. Structural details present at every magnification and visually similar components occurring at different scales.
Well, this is the architecture of the future.
Yeah,
And what this article and the conversation drives to the core of what architecture is, because architecture influences the human body and the ways of thinking, influences the brain, how the brain thinks, and that's totally dismissed for the last century, because architects have been trained to see architecture as detached. Okay, you create a design and then you put a person in. That's not the way it works. For a million years, the person put into a physical setting reacts with the physical setting, and the physical setting influences the health, the body, the thinking process, what the mind thinks, creativity, and intelligence. And most of that article that I mentioned uh, uh, presents evidence by biologists and doctors that show how the child growing up in different environments can have either more or less intelligence based on the visual impact of that environment. Now, this is huge. No architect has ever heard of this. And not only they have never heard of it, but they're not going to hear of it because all of architectural education is single-mindedly focused upon detachment. Okay, the architect designs something, builds something, doesn't care how the human being interacts with it.
yeah, it's true. It's almost like the value systems in architecture kind of randomly emerged as a result of like 20 people agreeing upon them early on. But yeah, they didn't really come from an objective scientific background. Um, but I believe that shift will happen. I mean, it was nice that when we looked at the Frank Lloyd Wright buildings where he actually had fractals embedded, we saw the small scale, the module, and the large scale building, and it was reflecting at each other. And then there was the example we saw last week with Stephen Hall, which it was just a square, like a square repeating, which I mean, I guess one can argue it's fractal, but if at the smallest scale it's just a simple square, it's like it doesn't have any articulation.
Ara, I'm professor of mathematics. That thing is not fractal. A fractal has a interesting complex structure at every magnification. So it's not just a huge square, a huge cube, and then tiny little squares. Where are the intermediate scales? In the Stephen Hall buildings, there are no intermediate scales. Okay, a
Right.
fractal is like tree or a fern leaf or a cauliflower. Okay, you take a magnification and then you see the structure, beautiful things are happening. It's complex, and then you magnify it some more, and more things are happening. You magnify it some more things are happening. You keep magnifying, down to the molecular level. Things are
Yeah,
happening.
it's
That's
true.
what a fractal is.
There's that famous, I forgot what it was called. It's the famous triangle with like a gap in the middle.
That's the
And then,
Sierpinski gasket. It's the
yeah,
Sierpinski gasket, and it exists. It has an architectural representation. The Cosmati family were Greeks from Constantinople who came to Italy, I think after the Turkish invasion of Constantinople, Istanbul, and they created stone-cut pavements for all the major churches. And those are called Cosmati pavements. And they are fractals, and they are exactly the Sierpinski gasket. And there are studies on these, beautiful photos you can find, because there are triangles within triangles within triangles. So the Cosmati became experts in doing these wonderful pavements by cutting triangles. Of course, when you cut stone for a pavement, you don't want to go down to tiny detail because it loses, too time intensive. But I have, looking through all the photos, and I have been to Rome, and I have looked, try to find all those churches with cosmetic pavements. I can find up to three scales, which is phenomenal because you have triangles within triangles, triangles, three scales.
and
So
then there's also the component of architecture that makes it pleasant, which is airflow and ventilation, obviously, and lighting, natural light.
well, that
But
has
yeah,
nothing to do with the visual. That has nothing to do with the visual.
that's true.
And three-dimensional volume, But that's a different and very important discussion because the modernists wanted to seal the building and use air conditioning. They were obsessed with technology. Okay, so in most climates of the world, it's better to have operable windows. But the
Yeah,
modernists were obsessed with sealing the building to have everything mechanical because everything is a machine. Okay, that's the obsession of the modernists. But
yeah,
that's different. That's different from the mathematical analysis of the form and the volumes.
that's true. Yeah, there was even the famous Le Corbusier quote, "The house is a machine for living in."
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The man was a lunatic.
Yeah,
A house is not a machine because a house affects the lives of people can live their entire lives in one house. It affects their lives. It affects the intelligence of the children growing up in the house. It's not a machine. It shapes biology. It shapes the human brain, especially the infant. It can either help or ruin a marriage. If the people living, if a couple living in a house is stressed because of the visual information and the geometry, they're going to keep fighting. They will separate.
man.
So this stupid modernist just ignored the humanity of human beings.
Yeah. It's like there's an attempt to, oh, I was flipping through Anne's PDF. She was talking about that people wanted to cover up the past.
Yes,
That is crazy. By building something worse. They want to cover up the past.
yes, yes.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Oh, here, Anne is joining us.
Oh, nice.
Hello, Anne.
Hi, I'm on the train.
Oh, you're on the train. Great. Going where? You're breaking up. We cannot hear you, Anne. Yeah, now you're frozen, Anne, if you can hear us.
Uh, Bye.
Yeah, we cannot hear you and you're frozen. Well, let's hope she went to give a talk somewhere or at the conference.
Oh, oh, the conference was today?
I don't know. I don't know. We'll hear when
Yeah.
she connects, when she has better Wi-Fi. I don't think they have very good Wi-Fi on the train.
And then there are some cities where they have patterns on the floor, which also adds an element, a fractal-like element, because a lot of the areas around me is just concrete poured for the sidewalk and just blank
Exactly.
street on the street. It's just asphalt, and there's no pattern. There's just a line, so the
Yeah.
concrete doesn't crack. That's it.
Yeah. Okay. That's sort of stubborn inhumanity. It's the minimalism of modernism. Now, where do you have beautiful patterns on pavements? In Portugal. In Portugal, there is a centuries-old tradition of beautiful patterns because they use stones. They don't, the old pavements, the sidewalks, they have stone. So they cut the stone about 10 centimeters square, blocks of stone, and then they put it in. But they use different color stones, a dark gray, a light, black, gray, and white stone, and they make wonderful, gorgeous patterns in the sidewalks. These are the old sidewalks that are still exist in the Portuguese cities that I visited. So the Portuguese took this tradition to Brazil when they colonized Brazil. So Rio de Janeiro has some wonderful old sidewalks, and other Brazilian cities that have this pattern. But since the Second World War, nobody has been building new sidewalks like this because they're obsessed with minimalism, and you know. It's a pleasure to walk in Lisbon when you see these patterns under your feet because you're walking outside. Okay, this is the sidewalk. It's public space. It's a pleasure to walk on these things. The only problem is that if there are stones, if stones come loose and they go missing, there's a hole there. So it's a little dangerous if there are holes. But if they maintain the sidewalk, it's fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this is interesting because this is the Portuguese tradition that went to Brazil, but the same tradition, as far as I know, does not exist in Spain. So Spain did not take it to the Spanish-speaking parts of South America. So I have not seen any interesting sidewalk designs in the rest of South America. Which I have visited Argentina. I do not remember anything. There's some beautiful buildings, but the sidewalks are just plain.
Yeah, that's true. And I'm trying to think if I think back about my Barcelona trip to see if I saw any sidewalks like that in Barcelona. And yeah, not many.
No, I've been to Barcelona. I don't remember any patterned sidewalks.
I saw a few in Armenia. I saw, oh, in Mexico City, there were definitely sidewalks like that.
Patterned sidewalks?
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
yeah, I
Uh-huh.
saw them in Mexico City. I saw them in Armenia. And then obviously in Italy, there are a lot of them. And fr I wonder if France. It's
I
been a
don't
while
I
since I went
don't
to
know any
France.
in France and I don't know any in Italy. But
Oh,
anyway,
really?
no, no, yeah, patterned sidewalks like the ones
Oh,
we're
that's
talking
true.
about. No, I don't know of any. But listen, this is not the importance of our discussion today is not about regional architecture or architectural history. It is about what to do today. And if you design a public sidewalk and put in a budget, even for $200 to put the design on the sidewalk, they will immediately attack you.
Yeah.
Those who approve the funding, they say, well, sidewalks have to be plain. No, they don't.
Yeah, it's crazy. I know in LA when we submit projects, every single material we specify, they say give us the International Code Council number. It has to be tested by the International Code Council, this material. It has to be
Really?
tested for fire resistance. It has to be tested for how much weight it can withstand. And all this testing, you keep looking and looking and looking. There ends up being just one product that's tested with the ICC. And they're like, oh, it's not just the ICC. It also has to be tested with this corporation. It has to be tested with I forgot what the underwriters laboratories. And when you find, okay, you find a couple that are tested with this one, but they're not tested with this one. And then there ends up just being like one roofing material, one wall finish, one floor finish, because they have so many requirements of testing companies that need to have approved this. Man,
Well, that's so narrow and constraining,
yeah, it really is.
and it has very bad implications for creating a visually healing environment.
Yeah.
I'm sure it does not improve the safety of the public realm or the materials. Because you find these natural materials in the traditional architectures somewhere in the world. Okay, that have been used for 1,000 years. What more testing do you want? Okay, it's there. It's the tradition for 1,000 years. Why do you want some stupid institute to certify the testing before you can put it on a sidewalk in LA?
True. And then there's the example you brought up where Christopher Alexander, even though it was concrete that had been poured, he had patterns embedded into that. So even then there's a way. So now that I think about it, it's actually not an excuse. We can embed things into regular concrete.
Right, right. You like Gaudi so much.
Yeah,
Much of what you like in Gaudi, he used broken ceramic tiles embedded in concrete, and they're
yeah.
gorgeous. And then when you go up to touch them, you see, this is concrete, and there are broken tiles embedded in a wonderful sort of jigsaw puzzle. But this is modern material; it's concrete. So to show you how perverse psychologically Le Corbusier was, he insisted on leaving the concrete raw and rough so you could scrape your fingers. Because if you put another material and embed it onto the concrete, you can make some wonderful surface. But he refused because he wanted this rough, hostile surface. I mean, this is perverse. This is sadistic. It's a shame Anne could not join from the train because she has studied
Yeah.
the lunacy of the Corbusian thought. But
I mean, his actual 5 points don't sound bad. We had one point about adding landscaping over the same footprint of the building on the roof. He had a point about horizontal windows that bring in a lot of light. He had a point about an open, flexible floor plan. Um, Open windows about pushing the columns towards the exterior, like free up I guess that's the same as what were Le Corbusier's 5 points? He had 5 points.
no. Don't reproduce them. It's like quoting from Adolf Hitler. The man is fundamentally evil. Let's take the horizontal windows.
Yeah,
Okay, the way you said it, it sounds, oh, it brings in more light. But no, it creates anxiety because there's nothing in nature that is extended and horizontal. Things in nature are vertical because of gravity. A window in a
interesting.
building, a big horizontal window in a building creates anxiety because you say, well, this is this solid structure, whatever it is, stone or concrete or steel or something, and there's a gap where the window is. That's going to collapse. It creates anxiety instantly. So long horizontal windows are a way to create anxiety in the viewer viewing from the outside. And I believe that Corbusier did this deliberately to create anxiety. He wanted to create anxiety. He was a sadist. So when you think about it, it's not a good idea. You can have many windows so you get light on the inside, and then from the outside, the structure seems solid because you see, these are windows, vertical windows, because the vertical window uh, matches the evolved the way the brain has seen things in nature, where you have vertical things. You don't have extended horizontal things.
Yeah,
When
it's
you
true. Makes sense.
look, there are some trees growing on cliff sides where there's a lot of wind, and the wind is blowing all the time. So those trees are tilted over because of the wind. And when you look at
Yeah.
them, you feel anxious. You say, this tree is about to fall down. Well, It's not about to fall down. It has grown because of the wind blowing. But it's unnatural. You know, the tree growing slightly horizontally gives you this unnatural feeling.
Yeah, it's true. The main elements that take load on a piece of architecture are vertical, and it would make sense to have the openings between them vertically rather than
Right,
force it to be
right.
horizontal and go along the whole perimeter. And
So,
then you try to
so
hide the columns. Yeah, it's
exactly.
weird.
So one of the points of this lunatic that you mentioned, it sounds nice when you said it's really evil.
And even his urbanistic approach was also really strange and sounds evil too. When he had these parks with these large buildings, these large dense buildings that were spread out, and they're like 50 stories high. It's a really strange way to organize urban space. It's not
Ara,
human.
now we move from evil to sheer stupidity and arrogance. The man was stupid and arrogant because he thought that he could build a 60-story skyscrapers and then keep parks in between. You are working now in cutthroat Los Angeles developers who will allow all these huge pieces of parkland to remain empty. They're going to cut it and they're going to build it in it. It's impossible to keep all this empty land.
It's true.
He didn't realize it. He had absolutely no idea of practical matters. He just had these crazy dreams, and he could draw well, so he drew these interesting detailed drawings, but they're totally unrealistic. So when you see where skyscrapers have been built according to Le Corbusier's model, uh, all the park in between has been filled in because the land is too valuable. And where you have just a concrete plaza in between the skyscrapers, and it has been kept empty because of regulations and zoning, it's a wasteland because nobody wants to use it. It's hostile. It is the structure of the urban space, and I have written books on urban space. The psychological impact of the urban space is hostile, so nobody wants to go there. Go back to Christopher Alexander's pattern language, where he has 5 or 10 patterns just on the urban space, and you have an entire set of conditions that make people want to use the urban space, and it has to be human scale, and it has to be semi-enclosed, and you have to have interesting visual character complexity in the surrounding buildings, and you have to feel the small scale structure, and it has to be connected with paths crossing the space and with things in the space. All these details. Corbusier knew nothing of this, even though it was right in front of him when he lived in Paris. There are so many wonderful examples of urban spaces, but he just ignored all of this and proposed ridiculous ideas that create hostile urban spaces.
And I think he never studied architecture. I think his background was in watchmaking and painting,
Yes,
and somehow he became the most successful, prominent architect of his time.
yes,
Oh, it just sounds like the Remcool House also.
yes.
Wow, I never drew that similarity before.
Le Corbusier was a genius at marketing and advertising, and he marketed himself and he marketed his ideas, but those ideas are worthless. And I could say the same of contemporary architects. I'm not going to name any names, but they're all very clever at marketing themselves and proposing ridiculous, inhuman projects and marketing those projects so they sound appealing to the clients and to the public and to the ridiculously stupid architecture critics. Okay, because you have the collaboration, the collusion of architecture critics, because instead of seeing a project that's proposed and say this is inhuman, it's going to make people sick, they say, oh, this is fantastic, this is brilliant. So the architectural critics are even worse than the architects. Okay, the architect's trying to make a buck, a dishonest buck. But the architecture critic, why is he or she pushing this inhuman project? What did they get out of it?
It seems like it's turning around. There was a massive building here recently by Eric Owen Moss, who, when you hear him talk about his architecture, it's brilliant. The way he talks is so entertaining, but the actual building is a very different thing from what he describes. And he did an office tower here recently, and all the reviews are saying it's so bland, it's so ugly, it's so hideous. Yeah, the reviews are not good, and the building is here.
Yeah, I've seen photos of that building. I don't want to
Yes.
say anything about Eric Moss because all his architecture is deconstructivist, and I dislike deconstructivist architecture intensely. So, you know, it's not only him, but every deconstructivist architecture, I think, is unappealing, unattractive.
You know that Coop Himmelblau rooftop? There's a
Yeah, yeah, in Vienna.
yeah, that one.
Yeah, yeah.
It's quite interesting looking.
Interesting.
Um,
Okay, all right. You think it's interesting? I want to compare it to some activists whom I dislike. Okay, so activists who want to protest whatever, climate change or the killing of baby seals, and they go to a museum and they throw tomato soup on a Van Gogh and make it ugly. So this Kub Himmelblau building sitting on top of the roof terrace to me is like that. It's just an ugly piece stuck on something rather beautiful. It's done to shock, just like the activists. But the activists are doing, can do damage because, okay, if they throw soup on a Van Gogh, okay, the curators can wash it. But maybe they throw some chemical that will damage the beautiful painting. They do it for the shock. And these deconstructivists are also doing it for the shock value. This is not architecture. Architecture has to help human health and not create anxiety. But a deconstructivist architecture is intended to generate anxiety. Is that what architecture should be? To generate anxiety? Isn't there, enough anxiety already in the world? So, what do you say about this? You live in Los Angeles, the city of spectacle,
yeah.
where everything is measured by spectacle, not by value or meaning.
It's a very developer-driven city. The financiers are the ones who make the decisions. And I wonder if it was different in the past. It seems
No,
like it
no, no,
was.
no. It was never different in the past. The person who has the money makes the decisions. But why do today's financiers pick projects that are disorienting and inhuman? It's their choice. They have the money. If they don't like a project, they should say, I'm not paying for this. I'm going to find another architect. But they approve and they build it. They pay for it. Okay, it's not the architect's fault. The architect can propose a project that's as inhuman and disgusting and sadistic as possible. But the architect doesn't get to build the project. The finance has to come from somebody. But somebody, the client, then approves this project. Why do they approve these inhuman projects?
I don't know. There was a period in China also around when the Olympics happened. There were a lot of
Yes.
really strange, large, massive buildings,
Yes.
um, high rises and stadiums. And then it seemed like the government shortly after that said no more weird buildings in China. And then they turned it around.
That was President Xi Jinping himself that wrote the letter. Now, if you didn't know, I wrote a letter advising the Chinese government. In fact, I wrote an open letter to President Xi Jinping before he published that letter. And I said that does China know it's ruining its architecture and its cities by approving these monstrous and inhuman buildings that are turning their back and negating China's heritage in architecture? So I wrote that, and my publisher in China translated it into Chinese and published it in several newspapers.
Wow. There was a building, the Water Cube. It was like a big stadium, and then the exterior walls were like 4 or 5 feet wide, and then there was like this structure inside that was like a water cube. It was like a steel structure, space frame. And when I was a third-year architecture student, they gave every student a different building to study and to build a model of and to draw. And I was assigned that building. And as I was sketching it, I was like, man, this is a really cool, interesting building. But then when you understand the scale of it, like when you see it at the small scale on a piece of paper, it's magnificent. But then when you actually imagine the actual dimensions, it's like way out of scale. It's like it's so massive you don't even perceive the water cube effect, and the scale really makes a big difference because a lot of these buildings are really interesting, but the scale they're built at makes it seem inhuman.
Yes. Okay. Well, something you said drew my attention. When I taught my architecture theory course, I had my students choose their building to analyze. I didn't assign them the building. So I just had to make a lottery. I gave them numbers to make a lottery because I knew several students were going to choose the same building, say building by Zaha Hadid or by Frank Gehry. So I wanted each student to analyze a different building so we could present them in class. So I made sure by the lottery system that whoever drew the lottery number would choose their building, and then somebody else could not choose the same building. But I let them choose the building. So half the students chose ridiculous deconstructivist buildings, and the other half chose normal, very nice, beautiful, contemporary and older buildings. And we did the presentations where they did the analysis according to my analytical principles of beauty and Christopher Alexander's principles. And so afterwards, we had discussions with some of these students that chose the weird deconstructible building said, well, now I see this is not such a good building. It seemed cool in the beginning, but now I see it's not such a good building after all.
It's like the scale of the articulation on Frank Gehry's buildings is a quite massive scale, and Zaha's too. But I mean, there are worse buildings. I mean, man, I don't know.
Look, Ara, there are so many bad buildings, ugly buildings that induce anxiety. I want to communicate the message that today we can build wonderful healing buildings. Why don't people do them? Because they're not taught in architecture. They're not taught the techniques in architecture school. The techniques are available. And then the market is not demanding. Look, if the market demands a product, then some enterprising company or architect will provide the product. But the market is not drawing good architecture because the market keeps selling and the clients keep buying horrible, ridiculous architecture, which is either bland or harmful because it induces anxiety. So that's the main problem.
So the fractal elements, it could be on I mean, obviously we have walls, interior, exterior walls, we have columns, but a lot of times the column is like a steel. We don't do columns like we used to, where it's like a beautiful, ornate.
Why not? Why not? We have the technology to produce beautiful columns just as cheaply as some horrible tubular steel column.
It's true. And I guess if the structural calculation calls for the tubular steel, it can be encased in a beautiful ornamented piece of concrete, and it would
Ara,
actually protect the steel too.
yeah, look, Ara, let me draw to your attention the period 1880 to 1920, when you had metal columns, cast iron, because it was before steel was commercially cheap. Cast iron columns, wonderful, because if it's cast iron, you can cast it in anything you want. You can make it beautiful. You can make it just a tube. That period does not exist in architecture schools. The
Mm.
industrial, beautiful precast elements of architecture. When you read histories of architecture, that's missing. Yeah, but you go to American cities, you go to European cities, and you look at buildings, 1918, 1910. These are industrial buildings. They're made from steel, well, cast iron, steel, a little bit of steel, concrete. They're wonderful. Architects don't study them because they don't know they exist.
Yeah,
Walk around. Yeah,
that's the
walk around.
Mies van der Rohe era. From that area, it's like we really dwell on Mies van der Rohe. But yeah, I'm
Yeah,
sure there are
yeah. I mean,
examples.
walk around Chicago, downtown. New York City, downtown, around around New York University. You see these industrial, really beautiful buildings made with the technology of the day, which today we have superior technology.
Yeah, it's true. There was Burnham and Root. There was
Yeah,
Louis Sullivan.
yeah.
Yeah, we don't look at them much.
I just told you something far worse. Not only we don't look at them, there's a gap. Architectural academia has erased this period. And we have so much to learn from this period because it was an industrial period, industrial production of beautiful tectonic elements for architecture. So if they don't teach something in architecture school, then the students become young architects and they come out and there is a gap in their knowledge that they never consider, and they become professionals with this gap in their knowledge. It's a very dangerous gap.
Yeah, it's true. There is a gap. And then when we start working in the field, we see another gap, which is, oh, what's the backflow preventer? Oh, how many PSI should this plumbing fixture be? Oh, what kind of specification do I write for this electrical wiring? What are the height and the distances of the outlets? And it's like, because this is what our authority having jurisdictions obsess over.
Mm.
So then now we're like, oh, school taught us the wrong thing. Now we have to learn about this thing.
Mm.
But it's like we never really focus on the human experience. It's just architects go their whole careers and it never comes up.
So,
Where our focus is always on something else.
yeah.
And it's not like we're just not working on it. It's just like, or all these entities are pushing, or the developer is pushing us in one direction. The city authority having jurisdiction is pushing us in one direction. Architecture school is pushing us in another direction. And none of them are really focusing on the human experience.
Exactly. So now let me raise the issue of your upcoming webinar with Nir Buras, classical architect. Nir has to work and make plans to satisfy all the requirements, all the technical coding that you mentioned. He does it, and he has a beautiful product. So what's the problem? You can work within those codes, I think overly restrictive codes, but you have architects who can navigate their way and produce a beautiful, very human scale building. So there is no problem.
Yeah. Mhm.
As far as the ornament, I keep seeing the same lie, blatant lie. We cannot do this today because it's too expensive. That's ridiculous. You can industrially produce any ornament you want. And I have people whom I know who are ornamentors, who work today for traditional architects in the United States, in Europe. They
Oh,
produce
wow.
ornament with industrial processes inexpensively that the traditional architects use in their buildings.
That is awesome. A lot of times the client comes and says, "Oh, I saw this property in your mind that looked like this. I want this." And it's like they really know what they want and they're very man, it's crazy. When you try to convince them otherwise, they tend to think you're lying to them. And they'll start yelling and they'll just be like, "No, this is what I want." And it's a really strange thing that happens. It's like, okay, you're hiring an architect and then you're telling them what to do and you're saying, "I want this building that looks like that other building." But I mean, there definitely is also uh, another type of client which is open to exploring, but it's more rare.
So, who do we pin the blame on? I already told you that I pin the blame on architecture critics and the media, who are propagandists for inhuman architecture. And what is astonishing to me is that these people have no skin in the game. They don't make money. Okay, they're paid to write articles. They can write about anything. They can write about, a new cooking recipe. But they choose to promote inhuman architecture and rave about it. So that influences the client, and then the client comes to you and tells you, "I want a building that looks like this, but this is ugly." No, I don't care, because their mind has been programmed by the architecture critics to want something that's inhuman. They don't realize it.
Yeah. I mean, you could argue it's the same with film. Like most movies are not quality movies. It's the same with literature. Most books are not quality books. It's the same. You could argue it's the same in a lot of different fields, that the majority of what's being produced is not of high quality.
But there is a difference, Ara. An author can be working on a job in a restaurant and write a book, okay, and find some small publisher and publish a book. But to build a building requires a lot of money from a client. It's not the same thing.
Yeah, book, yeah. Um,
So
I mean,
somebody writes a book and they manage to get it published small scale, and it's not a good book. Okay, so it does not hurt the world. But a lousy architect finds a client and they build a huge building, and then you have it there for 50, 100 years.
yeah, it's true. A great building is such a rare occurrence. It's like there's a few blocks that way. You got to go through this alley. You see this nice building. But yeah, most buildings are really, really not good. I mean, unless you're in Italy or somewhere, one of the few
Well,
rare
look,
cities.
I know Italy very well, but the good buildings are the older buildings. There are a number of good new buildings. You can count them on your hands, and I happen to know most of those architects. Those are traditional architects working today. In fact, one of them is Piercarlo Bontempi, and he tells a story that a group of Dutch tourists came up to his house, which fairly large house, because he has his house and then his studio, and he hires a lot of people. So they came up and they took pictures and they knocked on the door and they said, "We cannot find the plaque saying the date of this building." And he said, "I happen to be the architect. This building was
Whoa,
built 5 years ago." They said, "We don't believe it.
wow.
This is this is a historic building." He said, "No, no, it was finished 5 years ago, and I'm the architect." They wouldn't believe it.
Oh, it came out that good. That's
Yeah.
crazy. Yeah, and a lot of Leon Crier's developments look like again, yeah, you would think it's from a different time period because people just don't build that way anymore. Man.
Now let's examine something that you just said. Those beautiful buildings look like from a different time period. Why do they look like from a different time period? Because the time periods that we are both referring to, people took care to make them humane and attached to our human feelings. So the architects then were concerned with their buildings having a positive psychological impact on people who experience them, whereas today they don't. So if you build something today that has the same positive psychological connection with the user, it seems like it's from a different time period for this reason, not because it looks like something from the past, but because of the feeling.
It's
It
true.
either repels you or is totally neutral, bland like Walmart, or it attracts you. And if it attracts you, you say, it attracts me, so it must be from the past. But that's not true. It's a false conclusion.
Anne said something last time, and I just remembered it, and I think it's probably the reason. She said a lot of architects these days do buildings without ever visiting the site.
Yes,
And it's like you never visit the site, you just look at the site plan and the drawings on the computer and you design it there. And it's like you never actually go to the site and imagine the actual proportions, the dimensions of what you're drawing. But if you
yes,
do go to the site and you look around and start to visualize it, you're going to think differently and probably design more elements and it will come out more fractal just from the understanding the sheer proportions because sometimes we don't understand the actual dimensions of what we're drawing.
exactly, exactly. Now, let me recount Christopher Alexander's method for whoever's watching this video in the future. Christopher Alexander would go to a site with some with his students, assistants, with a truck full of 3-ply boards, some styrofoam boards, wooden sticks, pieces of string, little wooden flags. And they would walk the site and the surrounding area for hours. And then when they would imagine where the entrance of the building should be, they would put some sticks in the ground.
Oh, wow.
And then they would, go around, look at these, judge the view, taking into account all the surrounding buildings and all the surrounding spaces and trees and roads and sidewalks and everything else. And eventually somebody would go and hold a piece of 3-ply, for the main side of the building, or go back a little bit, go forward, come forward. That's it. That's the best position. And then they would mark it on the ground with string, okay, between
Wow.
two little posts. So they would do this for hours and then come back the next day, take a few days to do that. And then, so nothing is put on a drawing. When the entire building is planned with sticks and strings, with these visual experiments, then they take the tape measures and they measure where those sticks and strings are on the ground, and they transfer that to a drawing. So the design is made on the ground by the visual experience using these props, full scale, as close as you can get to a full scale prop. Because two people are holding up a big piece of 3-ply or styrofoam. So that is then transferred to a drawing.
Wow.
And even then, Christopher said, I know that the drawing transfer, that's the ideal drawing, but we have to ruin it slightly, but by making some right angles. Otherwise, it's not going to get the permission. But we try to keep that to a minimum, because if we try to clean it up to make it pretty on the drawing, we're going to ruin the eventual building, because the eventual building has to satisfy the emotions that we discovered there on the ground, walking around.
What a magnificent approach.
So this is Christopher's approach, and this is described in his books, The Nature of Order. This is how he built his buildings, and that's why they're so wonderful to experience.
I remember during his debate with Peter Eisenman, he brought up that if people start to pick up sticks and start to make the proportions of what they think should be built, the ideas will start to converge. And you'll
Yes.
see people who otherwise would disagree. When they start looking at a full-scale mock-up, they start to agree. And then Peter Eisenman was saying, well, if all the opinions converge, it's so boring. The window should either be too large or too small. It shouldn't be just right, because if it's just right, it doesn't exist. And it's like he always
Okay,
had
look,
this
Ara,
weird.
you pointed out a very important lesson for our audience. Peter wants the building to be disturbing.
Yeah.
That's his intention. I disagree with it violently, and I don't want to argue with Peter, but that's his intention. And let's go back to the description I gave you of Christopher's method of design. It is consensus because he's not alone making these decisions like Peter was. Christopher has like 6 or 7 people working there. And so 2 people are holding up a piece of plywood, big piece of plywood, and the rest are standing back and say, move forward, move back. So there's a consensus where the best position for the wall is.
Yeah, it's an amazing approach. I'm definitely going to borrow that, because right now most of my projects are picking up projects that other people left off, where it's like I'm trying to finalize it so the owner could get the building permit, and it's like I'm the projects I'm working on right now, I'm not really involved in the design that much, but God willing, the next batch of projects that come in, I am involved in the design, and we can go to the site and do a mock-up and visualize the proportions of what we're drawing.
Well, let me extend this method because Christopher uses this method for diagnosis and correction. If you inherit a lousy project, see if the budget allows some changes. Use Christopher's method. Okay, pretend nothing exists there. Okay, so there are certain things that are fixed on the project that you cannot change, but pretend nothing exists there. Use Christopher's method to plan the project to make it the most beautiful project possible. And by doing that, you see the contradictions, and I will tell you, these 2 points are really the worst. Can we change these 2 points? Okay, to make it beautiful, you have to change 15 points, but you can't afford that. But by doing this analysis in person with the psychological feedback, you see that the whole project falls apart because these are really 2 ugly points. So see if you can change those 2 points, and you improve the project by 50% by just changing these 2 points. So this is the diagnosis. Okay, a patient goes to the hospital, they do some tests, they say, okay, this patient has many things wrong with him, but the most important thing to take care of is this, otherwise the patient will die. So you prioritize. The other stuff we can take care of slowly, or the patient will live with these problems. You see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I do.
So I believe if you like what I just described of Christopher's method, which is described in his books, The Nature of Order, you can use this diagnostic method with a team. It has to be a team. You cannot do it by yourself. And identify the worst mistake and try to fix that, if possible. Okay, sometimes the worst mistake is structural. You cannot change that. So that's too bad.
Yeah, there's an example I'm thinking of right now where it's a house, and it's a quite nice house, and we're just adding a lot of square footage to it. And it'd be better if we did nothing to it. But yeah, we're adding square footage on the rear. It's like this second story is going to be added on, and it's hanging with columns to create a shaded space outdoor. And it's just like a block that's going to stick out of this nice building. Yeah, and it's already a decently sized house. It's a beautiful house, but it's we're adding masses that are sticking out just to maximize the square footage. And I don't know whose decision that was, but yeah, it was decided, and I guess the owner gets what the owner wants.
Yeah, but look, anyway.
But yeah, it's a good idea to from now on see what are the few points that are the worst, and start to address them.
What we discussed should be the bread and butter of architecture schools. But they don't
Yeah.
teach this. They don't teach this. They have no idea. It's all formalistic, abstract training. Well, we cannot reform the architecture schools.
I remember my theory teacher did give us Christopher Alexander's text. I thought he didn't, but then I met him, I saw him again recently and we were talking and he was like, oh yeah. And then I remembered, oh yeah, he did give it to us. But for some reason the emphasis is on the Corbusier. And I mean, thankfully some Frank Lloyd Wright also. But and then Mies van der Rohe. It's like the emphasis is not on the humane environment. The emphasis is on an arbitrary value system that certain people agreed upon.
Yeah, but didn't your teacher see that this is contradictory with what Christopher is trying to teach?
I think so. And I think his belief was that Christopher's ideas were outdated and overridden by superior ideas. I think that was his like subconscious belief.
Well, that's a shame because that's wrong. Christopher's
Yeah.
ideas were way ahead of his time because Christopher's ideas now are being validated by science. That's what I'm doing, since Christopher got old and passed away. I'm publishing one paper after another with many co-authors that we're validating Christopher's ideas with scientific findings, very recent scientific findings using the latest technology.
This how architecture builds intelligence lessons from AI. There's a lot here. I'm going to definitely spend more time with this and look at the audio you sent me too. I don't know where you sent it to me. I haven't seen it yet. But
I'll send it again.
okay. And I have the link on my website, but if anyone doesn't see the link, it's Nikos Salingaros, How Architecture Builds Intelligence Lessons from AI. I'm sure it comes up on a Google search.
Okay, I think we've talked enough.
Yeah,
Okay, Ara. So see you soon.
sounds good. Thank you so much.
Keep well.
I will, you too.